Thank you all for being here today. It's been about a year since we've done one of these lunch and learns, so thank you all for coming, and for those of you who have emailed me and support this program. So I told some of you to tell Chief to make sure you like it, so that way we can keep it going. I'm excited today to introduce our speaker to kick off the Lunch and Learn lecture series, Principal Chief Hoskin Jr. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We are live streaming, so just make sure that you have your phones on vibrate or on silent. So last August, the tribe decided to enact its treaty right of appointing a delegate to Congress. And Principal Chief Hoskin had appointed Kim Teehee, who is the current Vice President of Government Relations for the Cherokee Nation. So she couldn't be here today. I know a lot of the press releases initially said that she was going to be the one speaking, but we are very happy that Chief was the one that stepped in to speak for her. So anyway, he's going to answer some questions today about the treaty rights pertaining to the Treaty of Hopewell, and then also the Treaty of New Echota, and then today how all of this is being received not only across Indian country, but also just the United States and with the House of Representatives and Congress. So everyone, please give a warm welcome to Chief Hoskin.
Hello, Catherine. Thank you. So Kim couldn't be here, so it's time for the B team to come and talk to you. Now, I do appreciate the Lunch and Learn series. I appreciate the interest, and this topic I think is important for the precise reason that we assert the treaty right, but also more broadly about treaty rights and whether the country understands what everyone in this room no doubt understands, which is treaties are the law of the land. They're living documents, and they ought to be enforced. They ought to be respected, and the country ought to keep its word. That's kind of the basics there. You know, I've given talks on this subject a few times since we announced in August that we were going to assert this treaty right. And there's been two times when it's been particularly intimidating. One time, I did it in front of my former Indian law school professor, and it was just nerve-wracking because I know a little, but not compared to a law school professor. Now I'm talking about history in front of Catherine Foreman Gray, the noted historian of Cherokee Nation. So this is probably tied for first place as the most intimidating. But I appreciate the opportunity to speak to it. So, we all know, I hope we all know our history, but we know that before we were here, we were in the southeastern part of the United States. We were governing ourselves just fine before the explorers got lost and stumbled upon the continent. And so were the other tribes. So we engaged with the Europeans and the countries and the states that were established here. We engaged with the federal government in particular on a government-to-government basis, which is really the bedrock of the relationship between the United States and the Cherokee Nation today. And that relationship's embodied in a lot of ways, not the least of which are treaties. And that's really what this is about. It's about asserting a treaty right. So you go back to 1785, the Treaty of Hopewell, the first treaty that we had with the United States. It says that we should get a deputy in Congress, I think is the precise language. I don't know if we have that up there. I know it's so we're going to have some slides up here, and it may or may not coincide with what is coming out of my mouth at a particular time. But the Treaty of Hopewell, 1785. I Googled that this morning, so I knew that I probably got that right. I'm just kidding. So there we go. A deputy of their choice whenever they think fit to Congress. They have a right to send. We never enforced that, and I don't know why. There's probably some historians that do know why. I don't know why, but we didn't do it. So you go forward to the removal period, and we know the painful chapter of removal. Here's one thing I do want to talk about for a moment. One of the reasons that I think that the Cherokee people today have such grit and determination is because of what we've built up in our national character. And I think the time frame before removal was important to that. Because as I read the history, as the pressures were being brought to bear on the Cherokee people, as white settlers moved in, as states like Georgia said, this is our land and our laws ought to apply, we resisted that. I think one of the great resistance movements in the history of this country was the Cherokee people's resistance and their government's resistance. You know, the fact that we established what I think is one of the great democracies in the history of the world in the 19th century. We adapted the way we governed ourselves, centralized our power in a chief executive, had a council, had a judicial branch, a written constitution, adhered to the rule of law. And when we did those things to stand our ground. And that, I think, is remarkable. You know, Cherokees were great warriors, but this resistance wasn't with arms. This resistance was with our intellect and our ability to engage in diplomacy, our ability to reason, and our ability to communicate with the rest of the world. That's one thing that was very significant to me in my reading of Cherokee history. Sequoyah, the great genius, invents this Cherokee syllabary and creates a revolution of intellect, of communication across the Cherokee Nation, allows us to communicate with each other, not just about the ordinary day-to-day stuff of community, that's important, but what's going on in the country and what the United States is doing to the Cherokee people and what the white settlers are doing to the Cherokee people. That story that's as old as the country itself, really as old as the world itself, but as old as the country itself, that indigenous people had resources and had a way of life and had a foothold in their homeland that they'd had from time immemorial, and other people wanted it. That's about as simple as you can boil it down. But the Cherokee people resisted it, and we did it in a way that I think built something in our national character that sticks with us today. I firmly believe that. So along the way we resist removal, and we know the Indian Removal Act is passed by Congress, and it comes on the heels of some major victories in the Supreme Court of the United States for the Cherokee Nation. You know, the Cherokee Nation said we are a sovereign nation and the laws of Georgia should be excluded from our sovereign land, and the Supreme Court agreed with us to a large measure. They described us in a way that I think many in this room, myself included, would find a bit diminishing. They said we were domestic dependent sovereigns, but they said we were sovereigns. They said the laws of the state of Georgia don't apply. Andrew Jackson said, or at least they say he said, John Marshall, the Chief Justice, has made his decision and let's see him enforce it. And the Supreme Court also said that the Congress had plenary power over the relations between the United States and the Indian tribes. Congress passes the Indian Removal Act. They go about the business of trying to pressure the tribes into complying. So then we get to the Treaty of New Echota. That treaty is infamous in Cherokee history as being a treaty imposed on the Cherokee Nation. I say imposed because we know the history there. A minority faction of Cherokees agreed to this treaty, not the government of the Cherokee Nation. Can you imagine today the United States engaging in negotiations, say, with Great Britain, and they didn't like what they were getting out of the government of Great Britain, so they got the minority party in Great Britain and said, we'll deal with these folks, and we'll say that's the supreme law that governs. That's what happened in this country 180 some odd years ago. And that's a whole discussion probably for another day, and Catherine may have had a series on this, but that happened in the Cherokee Nation. It's controversial. It begins a very dark chapter in Cherokee history that led to our removal, that led to us losing a quarter of our population, 4,000 men and women and children and grandmas and grandpas and grandbabies wiped off the face of the earth because of this treaty, rounding us up in stockades. All because, and you can write books about this stuff, but at the end of the day, it's because someone believed they had more power, wanted what we had. And that's, unfortunately, sometimes history repeats itself, I suppose. That's a subject for another day. So, this Treaty of New Echota is, I think, something that evokes something emotional in a lot of Cherokees. It does in me. It makes me sad. It I think, begins a tragic chapter in the history of the Cherokee Nation. And I tell non-Indians, it's a sad chapter in the history of this country, because this country ought to be about the rule of law, it ought to be about fairness, it ought to be about all the things it aspires to be about. But that moment the United States failed to live up to its own aspirations. So that's why I think it's also a dark chapter in the history of this country. So the treaty has a lot of stuff in it, and it's the reason that we got removed. What I admire about the Cherokee government, though, is that we were stubborn. We didn't just say the treaty's been signed by this minority faction. We kept resisting. And I imagine this. I imagine Chief John Ross, the elected chief of the Cherokee Nation, the elected chief of the government that didn't sign the Treaty of New Echota, going to Washington, D.C., sitting across the table in the 1830s from federal officials and saying, this is unjust. You can't remove my people. This is our sovereign land. We were here before there was a United States. We were sure here before there was a state of Georgia. This is wrong, and the United States shouldn't do it. And I can imagine federal officials looking across the table at Chief Ross and saying, Chief, the Treaty of New Echota is the supreme law of the land, and you will abide by it. Now, I don't know if that jives with the precise historic record of meetings, but you get the sense that that's what happened, because we know John Ross went to resist removal or to get the best deal, if you will, that he could to mitigate the damage that he knew was coming. So he sits across from federal officials. You can imagine the indignity that befell our chief to go to that kind of meeting. So for me, and I'm jumping ahead, but for me to go to Washington, D.C., remember they told Chief Ross this is the supreme law of the land and you will abide by it. I got to go to Washington, D.C. and sit across the table from federal officials and repeat it back to them. And I got to say the Treaty of New Echota is the supreme law of the land and you will abide by it. And I did that for our people because that's what our people wanted. So there was a measure of justice just in that action. And that's not where we're going to end, but there was a measure of justice to say that. And as I did it, I sort of felt the weight of everything that came before us, each and every one of us, all of our ancestors. And it felt good, but we're not done yet. That's symbolic and it's important, but we're not done yet. So what does the Treaty of New Echota say? Why did I go to them and say, it's the supreme law? I was more respectful than that, by the way, but exaggerating a little bit. It says that we're entitled, are we in the provision here? Yes. So here's the operative language. It is stipulated that they, the Cherokee, shall be entitled to a delegate in the House of Representatives of the United States. Here's the kicker. This is the part of the language that we have to go meet a lot with Congress on. Whenever Congress shall make provision for the same. So Congress has a role in this deal. And when Congress has a role in something that deals with American Indians, sometimes it doesn't go so well. So, but there's a word in here that says shall. I like that word. It says they shall do it. So we look at this provision, and I do want to say, none of this was my idea. In fact, I was a delegate to the 1999 Constitution. And there's some other delegates in here. I see David Cornsilk is in here. I see Charlie Gord is in here. I didn't have the foggiest idea this provision existed. It's been on the books for 180 some odd years. It was delegates in the convention. David, I don't know if you remember who brought it up. I suspect you were probably one of them.
I wasn't one of them, I'll admit that, but I'm not going to say the name of the guy who was.
All right, well.
The chief.
Well, that's fine. No, it's the former chief of the Cherokee Nation, Chad Smith, brought it up. And Charlie Gord was was there at the beginning at the chair and through, and so this was discussed. And so we put it in our Constitution. We said that the chief shall appoint the delegate, and that's who we'd send to Congress. But we did it invoking this treaty provision. 180 years old, and that feels good to me. As a Cherokee, that feels good to me to go to Washington, D.C. and say this treaty, which imposed so much injury on our ancestors and cost us so much in resources that are immeasurable, our people, and cost us a lot in resources that are measurable, our land and our treasure, and ripped our government apart. We know what happened after removal. A lot of people say people are fighting and they were at each other's throats. We know Cherokees were literally at each other's throat after removal. Sometimes to deadly ends. It was a difficult time in Cherokee history, all because the government of the United States failed to even reach its own aspirations for fairness and justice. That's what I think. So there's the treaty, 1835. Nothing happens between 1835 and the 1999 Constitution, so far as I know, as far as governmental action with respect to this treaty provision. Again, this wasn't my idea, it was other Cherokees' idea, and they put it in the Constitution. So why, the question's asked when we go to Washington, D.C., why did it take so long, Chief, to do this? I think that's a fair question, don't you? 180 years. So this is what I tell them. Keep in mind, most of the people that ask this, and I'm talking about members of Congress, I'm talking about the Speaker of the House of Representatives who we met with, I'm talking about leaders in the House on both sides of the aisle, I'm talking about members of the Senate, members of the House, staff members, people in the media. Why did it take so long? And this is what I would like you all to understand, and you probably already have a sense of it, is most of these folks don't know Cherokee history. And that's something that we find to be a challenge all the time, isn't it? When we're trying to tell our story and the people we're trying to tell it to don't know some of the fundamentals. So what I tell them is this: yeah, it's been 180 years, but a few things happened in that time period. We were removed forcibly, rounded up in stockades, and lost a quarter of our population. I tell them all that. And then we did something that I think is one of the most remarkable stories of grit and determination and rebirth in the history, not of the Cherokee Nation, not of Indian country, but this country, and I say this world, that in a short period of time we rebuilt. We took what we had and we rebuilt a great democracy right here, didn't we? Right in this town, we rebuilt a great democracy. We invested in a system of justice, even though the system of justice in this country let us down, didn't it? The Supreme Court said this is the law and the Congress wiped it out. We still believed in it. We still had those same aspirations that the United States didn't live up to. And we believed in democracy, and so we rebuilt that right here, the great Cherokee democracy. We rebuilt it. We invested in our future. We invested in schools, institutions, ways of commerce, supporting each other, and we built a great society again right here after the rest of the world, most of them counted us out. Most of them thought the Indian problem with the Cherokees had been solved because they'll be gone. They won't survive this. We survived. We're still here. So we rebuilt. I tell them that part of the story. And then I talk about the Civil War, which happens, and we lost more people in the Civil War than we did in removal. And we were ripped apart during the Civil War, weren't we? Because we had some siding with the South for a variety of reasons and some siding with the North for a variety of reasons. So we're split apart in the Civil War, great destruction to our institutions, to homes and businesses, ripped through the Cherokee Nation. Well, when you're dealing with those sorts of things, trying to rebuild a society that the rest of the world said could not rebuild, when you're busy doing that, and then you're busy being ripped apart again by the Civil War, you don't have a lot of time, that's my sense, that's what I tell them, to go dig through the Treaty of New Echota and say we're going to send a representative to the U.S. House of Representatives. That's what I tell them. And then after the Civil War becomes those familiar pressures again, right? Other people wanted what we had. You could write books on this too. I can't write a book on it, but I can tell you it boils down to me that people wanted what we had. Railroads come in. There's pressures from the outside. The pressures of Oklahoma State, the statehood, the cause to civilize the Indians, by making sure we allot their land so there's private land ownership, even though we had just built this great society with communal land. That didn't go over too well with the country. And it didn't jive with this idea that the whole continent, essentially, or at least the big chunk of it, belongs to the United States and whoever wants to settle it. So those pressures came to bear. Again, we could talk all day about what happens next, allotments, statehood, and I think we didn't have time at that point to go dig through and say we're going to send a representatives. I mean, we are occupied by all these things, all these pressures. Then statehood comes, and so from 1907 to the 1970s, we had a government that wasn't functioning much at all. We had an appointed chief by the President of the United States. We didn't have an elected council. This is not the Cherokee Nation that they knew in the 19th century. They wouldn't have recognized the one in the 20th century. Most of my grandfather's life, he's a full-blood Cherokee, as proud of Cherokee as I've ever known. Most of his life he didn't get to vote for a chief or a council or expect much out of his government or expect to participate much in his government. He would not have dreamed, I can tell you that his grandson would be chief of the Cherokee Nation. He'd be proud of it, but he wouldn't have dreamed it for most of his life. So during that period of time, we sure can't send a representative to Congress because we can't even elect our own chief. So in the 1970s, there's reform throughout Indian country with respect to federal policy. There's some laws passed. The Principal Chiefs Act is one that says we can essentially restore our great Cherokee democracy again. We had done well. The lesson from history for me is anytime the United States steps out of the way, we do amazing things. That's the lesson. I don't tell them that because they would be a little sensitive about that. But I kind of tell them that. So I say since the 1970s, when the Congress enacts laws that allows us to engage in self-determination, exercise the attributes of sovereignty, elect our chief, elect our council, chart our own destiny, we do great things. So since the 70s, yes, could we have sent a delegate to the House of Representatives? We could, but again, we're picking up again. We're rebuilding since the 1970s. We're trying to scratch out a way to get revenue so we can do things for our people. And we don't have, I think, bingo until maybe the late 80s. And before then, the revenues are very scarce. And so since gaming and the ability to take those revenues and do more things and diversify our businesses and have different streams of revenue so we can invest in ourselves and all that you see around us that's been building up over the last 40 years, that's one of the great things I think about the Cherokee Nation. We can look at everything around us and we can say, particularly in the last 40 years, so many people had a hand in building this, but it all belongs to the Cherokee people. I think we did amazing things in the last 40 years. So here we are in 2019. I remembered the Cherokee Nation Constitution Convention. I was amazed that we had this right. But I was Secretary of State for a number of years, and I was on the council, and I admit I didn't do anything to assert this provision. I wish I had a great answer for you as to why we didn't. But what I can tell you is we're all human. We only have so many hours in the day. There's certain things that you want to prioritize, and in the last 8 years, we had a lot of priorities, and I think we did a lot of great things in the last 8 years. I really do. I really do. And that takes a lot of attention. You gotta, when you're an Indian nation in this country, you gotta pick your battles. You gotta know when to pick them. And I don't want to necessarily call this a battle that I've picked, but it's a challenge that we've taken on. We gotta pick those carefully. And I picked it because I thought, and still do, think that we're at a very strong point in the history of the Cherokee Nation, economically, politically. I think we're gaining more respect in Washington, D.C. I also think this. Everybody in this room is a proud Cherokee citizen, or you're a good friend of a Cherokee or family, and you're here and you believe in what we're doing and you're proud of us. I think every single one of us to a person feels that way. And I bet you every one of us also feel the way I feel. I'm also a proud American. I think this country is at its best when it keeps its word. I think it's at its best when it tells the truth. And I think it's at its worst when it doesn't keep its word. Now, I can't think of a more direct and concrete test for this country, for the Congress, than to take our 180-year-old treaty that says we have a right to a delegate in the House of Representatives, go to the United States and say, it's time to keep your word. And so that's what we're doing. How are we doing it? How are we doing on time, Catherine?
We're good.
We're good. So how have we been doing it? We had the event in August where I announced Kim Teehee. And do people know Kim Teehee in this room? Probably many of you do or have heard of her. So if I had to write sort of what the best experience to be a delegate, there she is in the House of Representatives, I would just look at her resume and I would write it out. She was an intern for Wilma Mankiller, and she worked in Cherokee government. She's got a law degree. She worked on Capitol Hill and didn't just work as a staffer. She made it a point to try to bridge the gap in a bipartisan basis on stopping legislation that would hurt tribes and promoting legislation that would help tribes. That's what she did. The Native American caucus in the Congress is formed in large measure because of her efforts. And then she works in the White House, works for the President of the United States, advising on Indian issues. and she's worked in the private sector. And then we had the good fortune to lure her back here around 2015, where she's headed our government relations effort. That effort has resulted in a lot of things that benefit the Cherokee people. The joint venture, largest in the country, health center, that happened because we had to convince Congress to do the right thing. Kim Teehee helped lead the charge on that. Even though it was struck down by the courts, David Cornsilk's idea to make sure that if you were an artist in Oklahoma and you were an Indian artist and you wanted to say you're an Indian artist, he thought you have to be an Indian to do that? Novel idea. So we took up that idea and pushed it forward, and Kim Teehee helped lead that effort. It was struck down by the courts, but we got it through the legislature. The Stigler Act, the act that stripped our trust land, that said that if you go over below a half blood quantum, you lose your restricted status. Never before has Congress passed a law that's done its job so well than the Stigler Act. It was designed to destroy Cherokee land title, and it did an amazing job, fantastic job, and the other 5 tribes too. Such a good job that we've lost 80–90% of our restricted land over the last, half century or so, or really since the last century. That got reformed. Now, she would say she doesn't do it by herself, and that's true, but she does lead these efforts. She's very skilled. She could walk into Congress today and be one of the most effective members of Congress. So that's the reason I asked her to do it. Plus, if you have a challenge in any Cherokee community and you really want to get stuff done, and you need somebody with wisdom, and you need somebody that will work hard, here's what I've learned. You ask a Cherokee woman for help, you get out of her way, and you help her if she asks you to. So that's why another reason I asked Kim Teehee. When we send a full-blood Cherokee woman to Congress, they're not going to know what hit them. And that's good, because we need a voice in Congress. So that's one of the reasons I asked her to be the delegate. The Council of the Cherokee Nation unanimously supported her. Now, did she take her seat in Congress? No, because you remember that language up there, whenever Congress shall make provision for the same. That language can't mean that Congress can never do anything, can it? Why would it be in there if Congress could get away with never doing it? So I think they're on the hook myself. Now, I don't know if you know this, the United States has sometimes not complied with our treaties. Have you heard this? It's true. Every one of them, in fact, they've broke. But I am counting on the country being better than it has been in the past. I'm counting on the country believing in this idea that the United States ought to keep its word. If it ought to keep its word to anybody, it ought to keep its word to the Indian tribes that were here before there was the United States. So I'm asking the Congress to keep its word. How do we do that? Well, there's delegates in the Congress right now. They're non-voting at the final passage level, but they're voting members at the committee level. They can introduce legislation. They can engage in debate. They can build those relationships on Capitol Hill that are really vital to getting things done. So there's 2 ways to do it as far as we can tell. One is you ask the House of Representatives to change its rules. The House of Representatives can change its own rules. We ask them to change it and to seat our delegate. It'll be the first time in history they've done it. That's one route. The other route is to follow the template that was laid out previously by delegates. The delegate to the Mariana Islands was the last one in 2008. That took an act of Congress, passed the House, passed the Senate, signed by the President. That took that. That's a pretty heavy lift, but I think all 3 branches ought to live up to the word of the country. But the more efficient route would be just to have the Speaker of the House and the majority change the rules, seat Kim Teehee. Those are kind of broadly the 2 ways we could do it. We've been talking to members of Congress. I can tell you this, and I think this says something about the Cherokee Nation. No one's told us no. No one's told us there's no way this is happening. Most of them told us this should happen. The Speaker of the House of Representatives, before we met with her, 3 hours before we met with her, gave a speech before the National Congress of American Indians, and she said, I'm excited because this afternoon I'm meeting with the Cherokee Nation about Native American representation in Congress. To great applause, but the Speaker of the House said that. She didn't have to say that. She did say that. And she's a Democrat. People on the Republican side have given us support. Congressman Mullen has given us support. Congressman Cole has given us support. Okay, so there's a bipartisan consensus growing that this is the right thing to do. It's never been done before. There's a few issues, though. The House of Representatives is a body composed of all elected officials, all elected by their constituents. Kim Teehee has been appointed by me. Why has she been appointed by me? One primary reason, that's what our Constitution says, appointed by the chief. Doesn't say it's elected. Well, here's the other reason. The other reason is that we read the treaty as giving the government of the Cherokee Nation a representative in Congress. Now, there's no other representative in Congress right now that represents a government. They represent citizens. So the Mariana Island delegate represents the American citizens that are there. It's a territory. Washington, D.C. has a delegate. She, Eleanor Holmes Norton, represents individuals she's elected by. Kim Teehee was appointed by me, confirmed by the council. The House of Representatives never dealt with this before. But just because they've never done it doesn't mean they shouldn't do it. It just means it's taking some time to explain it to them, get feedback. So right now we're in the stage where we're going back and forth with staff and members of Congress, explaining, understanding, answer their questions. And that's one question they had. Why is this person not elected? That was our answer. Here's the other issue. What about dual representation? Everybody in this room is probably in the 2nd Congressional District. There's a congressman in the 2nd Congressional District, and we all vote for that seat. Nobody else in the country gets 2 members of Congress, right? Everybody gets 1 member of the House of Representatives. We get 2 senators, 1 member of the House. The Cherokee Nation says that it's not representing the individual constituents, it's representing their government. And there's the distinction. So that is our theory. That's what we believe delegate meant in the 1830s when that treaty was crafted. And we're doing some historical research about what delegate meant then. It has to mean, though, to me, some presence in the House of Representatives. And it can't mean that the Congress can say no. How can they say no when it says they shall make provision for the same? Why put it in there if the Congress could say no? They have to say yes. When will they say yes? I don't know. If we get this done by the end of 2020, I will be pleasantly surprised. But I'll be sorely disappointed if we don't ever get it done. And we ought to get it done because it's the right thing to do. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's my presentation on the congressional delegate. You got the layperson's history from your chief. Now, next month, Catherine Foreman Gray will do an entire topic on everything the chief got wrong and the history. We'll leave that for next month. But it's been a pleasure to talk to you. I know we need to carve out time for questions. I'm happy to answer any. Thank you very much.